What we're going to be building in this tutorial is a very simple Web3 application. We'll be using Thirdweb's Connect SDK, and we'll also be deploying our very own smart contract. So the end application here is a very simple counter app that is going to interact with a smart contract. So we have a Connect Wallet button here. We can click on this. We can select how we want to connect to our Web3 application. In this case, I'm going to select MetaMask here. Once a wallet is connected, we'll see our counter. You can see currently our counter is at 5. We can increment. This will execute an on-chain transaction here. You can see here, I can just confirm this transaction. You can see in our console here, we're incrementing. It increments the counter to 6. We can do the opposite. We can decrement here. We can hit that little minus sign. We can confirm that transaction as well. You can see we're decrementing here in our console, and our counter goes back down to 5. We're doing a few things here. We are being able to connect a Web3 wallet to our application. We're able to read data from our smart contract. In this case, we are reading the counter. And we're also able to execute functions from our smart contract as well. And that include the functions to decrement and increment the counter, or the variable of the number that is stored right over here. Hey everyone, Sean Wataza here, back with another video. And in today's tutorial video, we're gonna go over how to build your very first Web3 application utilizing Thirdweb's Connect SDK. And what we'll be building specifically is a very simple counter application, and we're going to be using the newest version of the Connect SDK, which is going to be version 5. And we're going to walk through some of the basics of how to start building Web3 applications with it. Now, an overview of what we're going to be actually doing in this video, we'll first start off by creating ourselves our very own smart contract. And this is going to be a counter smart contract. It'll be a very simple smart contract, so don't worry if you've never created a smart contract before. It'll be very easy and simple to follow along. We'll go over some of the very basics of Solidity, and we'll be able to deploy our own smart contract. We'll then take that smart contract and start building out our Web3 application. Again, we'll be using the newest version of our Connect SDK, which is version 5, and we'll build our very own Web3 application to interact with the counter smart contract we deployed earlier. And by the end of this video, you'll have a very simple Web3 counter application like you saw demoed in the beginning of this video. So with all of that being said, let's jump on the computer here and let's get started. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is deploy ourselves a smart contract. Now, through ThirdWeb, you can deploy pre-built smart contracts. If you're on the dashboard here and you come to contracts and you hit deploy contract, you have a selection of pre-built contracts that you can deploy through ThirdWeb. Now, we're going to actually deploy our very own smart contract. And to do this, we'll be creating our very own counter smart contract and deploying it through ThirdWeb's dashboard. What we'll do here is we'll come to our terminal and we'll run npx thirdweb create contract. And this is a CLI command here where we can create a contract utilizing ThirdWeb. We're going to name our project folder here. I'm going to name this our counter contract. And then you can select the framework you want to use. So we support Hardhat or Forge. Now, if you aren't familiar with the differences between the two, we're not going to go in depth into it in this video, but these are two popular frameworks used to create smart contracts with Solidity. So I'm just going to use Hardhat here. And then we're going to name our new smart contract. And for this, again, we're going to be creating a counter smart contract. So I'm going to name it counter here. And then we can select the type of contract we want to start from. Now, you can select pre-built contracts like ERC 721, 20, or 1155. This will give you the base contracts for those standardized tokens, and then you can build from there, or you can just deploy the base contracts, but we also give you the ability to customize the contracts as well. But we're not going to be doing any of that in this video. We're going to actually just create an empty contract, and we're going to create our new smart contract from scratch. Once that's done, we'll change into our counter contract folder. Then we'll open that up in our code editor. Now, once opened up in your code editor and your Explorer here, you're going to see a contracts folder if you're using Hardhat. If you're using Forge, you're going to see a source folder. And in that folder, you should see your contract Solidity file. So go ahead and open up your Solidity file here, and you should see some basic Solidity code here. This is all you need to start creating and building out your smart contract. We have here pragma Solidity, which shows us the version of Solidity that we're going to be using. And we have our contract here. Now, our contract, we can name this again, we'll name it counter. And there is a constructor function in here. We're not going to go over that in here, but we're going to remove the constructor function because we're not going to need one within this smart contract. But the first thing we're going to do to start building out our counter smart contract is to create a variable that is going to hold our current count. So whatever the value of our count is, we're going to store it in this variable here. And this variable we're going to say is a uint256. It is a public variable, meaning that it can be viewed by anyone who views our contract. And we're going to call it a count. And the initial count is going to start at 0. So again, this is just creating our count variable. And this variable is what we're going to be incrementing and decrementing using our functions here that we make. So the first function we're going to create is, we'll say increment. And now increment, we're going to say is a public function, meaning that anyone can call this function and execute it. And all we're going to do with the increment function is increment our count variable +1. Very simple function here. We're just incrementing the current value of count to +1 of whatever the current value is. Next function we're going to create is going to be the decrement function. This is also going to be a public function that anyone can call. Now in the decrement, we're going to add a few more things because we don't want to be able to decrement below 0. We don't want it to be a negative number. We only want to be able to keep positive numbers. In Solidity, we can use the require here, which we have to require a specific condition. So in this case, we want the count to be greater than 0. And if it is equal to 0, then or less than 0, which we shouldn't be able to do, but if it is equal to 0, we'll present the error here saying count cannot be less than 0. So we're going to require this first before being able to actually execute the function that we make, which is we're going to decrement the value of count by 1. So all we're adding here is this requirement here, checking that the value of count is actually above 0. And if it is, then we can decrement it. If it is equal to 0 or below 0, we shouldn't be able to, and it won't execute this function here. So we have our increment and decrement functions. Next, we need to create a function here, and we're going to call this one getCount, and this is going to retrieve the value of the count variable for us. And this is going to also be a public function. Anyone can call this function. We are going to specify that this is a view function. This is just a read function to retrieve data from our smart contract. We're not going to be changing any data like the increment and decrement functions here. We're not changing any values. We just want to be able to read a value or view it. And that's why we're putting view. And then we're going to specify it that it returns a uint256. And all this read function is going to do is return us the value of count. So all we're going to do here is return count. It's just going to retrieve the value of the variable and return it to us. Again, we specify that it returns a uint256, which is the type of our variable of count here. And there you have it. We created a very simple smart contract. And what we need to do now is deploy this. Now, again, a quick overview is we have a variable that holds our count value. We have an increment, which increases it by 1. We have a decrement, which decreases the value by 1, but it checks to make sure that the value is actually higher than 0 before doing so. And then we have a function to retrieve the value of our count variable, and that returns it to us. Now we're going to deploy this smart contract. So I'm just going to open up the terminal here within my code editor, and I'm going to run npx thirdweb deploy. And this is going to deploy our smart contract. And what this will do is actually compile our smart contract or Solidity file here. And then it'll open up within our ThirdWeb dashboard. And we'll be able to deploy our smart contract that we just created utilizing the ThirdWeb dashboard. So I'm going to run npx thirdweb deploy here. It's successful. It compiles it, uploads the metadata. It opens up a tab here in my browser. You can see here, we're going to deploy the counter contract. And from here, we can select the network or chain that we want to deploy our contract to. Now, in this dropdown, you can select any EVM compatible network or chain. We support any EVM compatible network or chain with ThirdWeb. So you can search mainnets, you can search testnets, you can just come in here, put in the chain ID if you want to. You can see here, mode testnet, or I can choose testnet here, and you can choose things like Sepolia, base Sepolia, Arbitrum Sepolia, Optimism Sepolia, and so forth. So whatever network you want to deploy to, you can select it in here. Just be aware that whatever network you deploy to, you have to make sure that you have some funds for that network in your wallet so that you have the ability to deploy the smart contract. I'm going to select the base Sepolia here, and I'm going to click deploy now. This is going to open up a transaction here to deploy our contract. So I'm just going to hit confirm. Then we're going to get a second pop-up here, and this is going to be a signature request. And we just need to sign this signature request here to add this contract to our ThirdWeb dashboard. I'm going to sign that here, and we'll be able to look and see what the contract dashboard looks like and features and everything it allows us to do within our contract. So there you go. Our contract has been successfully deployed. There you go. You can see we have our counter contract here deployed on base Sepolia testnet. This is our contract address. We'll need that when we start building out our Web3 application. And you can see this is the overview page here. We have some analytics here that will show things like unique wallets, total transactions, total events. We have latest events here, which our contract, we didn't have any events in it, so we're not going to have anything that pops up here. But on the left-hand navigation here, let's come on over to the Explorer tab. And the Explorer tab is actually going to allow us to view all the functions that we created within our smart contract. Now, these functions are categorized within two categories here. We have write functions, which allow us to execute the decrement and increment functions. Now, write functions, these are things that are actually going to write data to the blockchain. That's why they're under write here. If we decrement, we can execute, but if we try to execute this here, you can see that we get our error that we put in our smart contract, which count cannot be less than 0. And because we are starting at 0, we can't decrement it below that. We can go to increment here, and then we can execute that as well. But before we do that, let's head on over to the read tab. And you can see we have count here. This is actually our count variable. So it shows us the value of count here. We also have a function called get count. And this is that view function that we created at the end of our smart contract, which retrieves the value of count and then provides it to us right over here. So you can see that's 0 as well. Now if we come to write and we go to increment, and let's execute increment here, we get a transaction window that comes up. Again, we have to pay for gas because we are changing data on chain here. So we're going to confirm. There you go. Our transaction has been complete. Now, if we come to read and we go to count, you can see our variable is now 1. We hit get count, it retrieves that count variable and provides us the value of 1 as well. So you can see within our ThirdWeb contract dashboard, we can go to the Explorer tab and we can actually start to interact with our contract here very easily. So again, we can view all those write functions, we can view all of our variables and read functions here, and we can interact with the smart contract. This isn't going to be a user-friendly way for your users or anything to interact with your smart contract, and you probably want to build a Web3 application and build a nicer user experience that a user can come into your counter app, view the count, connect a wallet, and then maybe have some buttons to increment and decrement the counter here. So now let's take this smart contract and let's actually build a Web3 application utilizing ThirdWeb's Connect SDK. I'm going to come back to my terminal here. I'm going to just change out of our counter contract and let me just clear this. And we're going to now build our Web3 application. Now I'm going to create a next project here. I'm going to run npx create next app, and I'm going to call this our counter app. And it's going to ask what I like to use TypeScript. I am going to use TypeScript in this tutorial. Node to ESLint, Node to Tailwind. We are going to use source directory and app router for this. And I'm not going to customize the default import alias here. So we're creating a new next project as you would if you ever built a next project before. We're going to change into our counter app here. And I'm going to open this up in our code editor. All right, so now we have our counter app opened up in our code editor here. Let's take a look at ThirdWeb's documentations really quick and walk you through our documentations on how we can start using the Connect SDK to build Web3 apps. So this is our documentation page here. We'll do a quick walkthrough on how you can find our documentations for the Connect SDK. In the top navigation here, come to SDK. We're going to be using the TypeScript SDK here. And right over here, you can see all we need to do for installation in our overview page is run either npm, yarn, pnpm, or bun, depending on what you're using. So right over here, I'm using yarn. I'll just run yarn add thirdweb. So coming back to our code editor here, I'm going to open up my terminal here in my code editor, and I'm going to run yarn add thirdweb. We'll run this, and we will now install the thirdweb Connect SDK. There we go. So we'll close this down. If we look at our package JSON here, if we scroll down just a little bit, you can see we have thirdweb. We're on version 5 right over here. And now we can start building out our Web3 application. Now coming back to the docs here, if we take a look at the core here, and we're going to have to set up a few different things. Now, the two things that we'll need here are our client and our chain. These two things are going to be important for our application. The client here is our entry point to the ThirdWeb SDK. We're going to have to provide it with our ThirdWeb API key. So we're going to create our client. We're also going to create a chain here so that our Web3 application or the ThirdWeb SDK knows what chain we're going to be interacting with. So we're going to set up those two things first. So coming back to our code editor here, I'm going to go into our file directory here. I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this folder utils. And within that utils folder, I'm going to create a new file called constants.ts. Now within that constants.ts, I'm going to first create my client. So let me just close this here, and we're going to export this constant because we're going to be using this throughout our application. This is going to be my client here. And if we come back to our docs, you can see if we go to client, we need to use the create thirdweb client here. So I'm going to come back here, and we're going to say create thirdweb client. We're going to import the create thirdweb client here. We are importing this from thirdweb, and our create thirdweb client, we need to provide it with our client ID. So I'm going to actually create another variable up here, and we're going to call this our client ID, and this here is going to be our thirdweb API key. Now I'm going to store this in a .env file, so we're going to say process.env.next public client ID here, and I'm going to come over to my file directory. I'm going to create a new file. I'm going to create a new .env file. We'll then take that variable that we created, which is next public client ID. We'll paste that in there. And let's now get our client ID here, which is going to be our thirdweb API key. So coming back to the thirdweb dashboard, let's come back to our thirdweb dashboard here. I'm going to come over to the settings tab. And right over here, you can see API keys. So we'll quickly go over API keys here. So let's create a new API key. We can name our key here. Let's just say this is for our counter app. Down here, allowed domains. So you can put in the domains that you are allowing this API key access to. For this tutorial, I'm just going to allow all domains. That way I don't need to worry about adding in which local host my project is running on. It's just providing you with that knowledge and warning you there. We'll proceed. So you can see here, we have our client ID. You'll also be provided a secret key. Now this secret key is going to be used for anything that we need to do server side. Now you're only going to be given this secret key once, so you do want to store it somewhere where you won't lose it. You can't generate a new secret key. So if you do lose the secret key, you just need to create a new API key in all. We're going to say, yes, confirm I stored my secret key, and we're going to hit complete. So there you go. Now I have my counter app key here. So if we click on that, you can see through your API key, you can configure a few different things. So in here, you're given your client ID. You can see a part of your secret key, so you know which one it is. You have the date created, date last updated, and you also have a last access. Now we haven't used this client ID yet, so we're not going to have anything there. We have access restrictions. So again, you can set up the domains that your API key has access to. You can also set up bundled IDs here. These are going to be things for like your Unity games or your React Native mobile apps. So you can add those bundle IDs right over here. And then down here, you have services. So you can actually toggle on and off the services that you want the API key to have access to. And these things include storage. So this includes IPFS storage. You can download and upload to IPFS. You have RPC usage. You have account abstraction. This is going to be for things like your bundler and paymaster. You have embedded wallets, which include things like social logins and email logins. You have checkouts. This is to purchase NFTs with a credit card. And then you also have pay, which is something new that we introduced, which is blockchain transactions with any currency. So you can toggle these on. You can configure them. If we come over to the top and we hit edit, we can change the name, all of that information. We can toggle these services off if we don't want access to them with this API key. You can also go within some of these services here, like account abstraction. You can see here you can configure things like sponsorship rules, and you can go in depth into all of these and configure what you want to allow access to with that API key. So coming back to settings here, all we're going to do is copy our client ID over to our code editor and paste that in for our client ID variable. I'm going to close that .env file, come back to our constants.ts file here. And for our client, the create ThirdWeb client, we're going to provide it our client ID, which is going to be our client ID. And we're going to say as a string here. There we go. So now we have our client set up that we can use throughout our application. Next thing we need to do, if we come back to our documentation here, is set up that second thing, which is chain. And again, this defines the chain that our application is going to be working with. Now, we can do this a few different ways here. You can see we can use the define chain and provide the chain ID of the chain that we're using. We also have some predefined popular chains. So we can actually, if we look at popular chains here, you can see right over here, we have chains like Arbitrum, Arbitrum Nova, Avalanche, Base, Base Apolia, Ethereum, and this list has some of the popular chains, and we can just specify that chain and import it from thirdweb/chains. Or we can configure our own chains. This includes using define chain again. We provide the chain ID, but we can also provide things like the RPC endpoint we want it to use, the native currency, block explorers, etc. And we can provide our own custom information for the chain. Now in this one, we're just going to use the define chain here. So we're going to come up here. We're going to export our variable called chain. And this is going to, again, equal, we're going to use the define chain. And all we need to do is provide it with the chain ID. Now, because I'm using Base Apolia, I'm going to provide it with Base Apolia's chain ID, which is 84532. And there you go. We now have our chain set, and we can use that throughout our application as well. So again, client and chain are those two important things that we're going to need and use. So now that we have that set, let's come back to our documentation here. And let's jump on over to the React section here. So in the React section here, and the React SDK provides us with some components and hooks that we can use to make it easy to build Web3 applications and interact with smart contracts. And you can see getting started here, the first thing we should do is set up our ThirdwebProvider. And the ThirdwebProvider here is a component that sets up React query context for the ThirdWeb SDK. And you can see here, all we need to do is wrap our application here with the ThirdwebProvider. So in this case, if we come back to our code editor, I'm gonna open up my files here, go under my source folder. In the app folder, I'm gonna head to the layout.tsx, and we have our application right over here. All I'm gonna do is wrap the children here with the ThirdwebProvider. So I'm gonna just add the ThirdwebProvider, and we're gonna take the children here, and we're gonna put that right inside here. We're gonna have to import the ThirdwebProvider. Now I'm gonna import ThirdwebProvider from thirdweb/react here, and we're gonna run our application really quick. So when we run our application here, you'll see something really quick. You'll see here that you'll see this error saying use state only works in client components. So, and that is because of our ThirdwebProvider here. And that's because, again, if we look at the error, we can't use client components unless we declare a use client here. Now, we're not going to do that within our layout.tsx file. So what we'll have to do is come on over to our file directory. Within our sources and in our app folder, we're going to create a new file here called thirdweb.ts. And in this thirdweb.ts file, let me just close this real quick. All we're going to do is export our ThirdWeb provider from ThirdWeb React. Now what we'll do is we'll tag this document here. We'll tag this file with the use client here. Now coming back to our layout, instead of importing it directly from ThirdWeb React, we're going to import this from our ThirdWeb file. So we'll do @/app/thirdweb. Save that. We'll come back to our application here, and you can see now it is running normally. Let's now come back to our documentations here, and let's come back to the overview here. So we set up our ThirdWeb provider. Now let's connect a wallet. So this is an important part when building Web3 applications. You have to have a way to interact with a smart contract on chain. And the only way to do that is to have a wallet that is going to execute and interact with the blockchain. So we need a way for our users to connect a wallet. Now we provide two components here. You can use the connect button or connect embed. And we're gonna the connect button UI component. And if we come to the connect button UI component, which is in the UI components under connect button here, we can see here, we just need to add the connect button, provide it with the client here that we created in our constants.ts file. So let's come back to our code editor here. Let's come to our files. Let's come over to our page.tsx file, which is the boilerplate code here that gets created for you when you create a new Next project. I'm going to delete all these imports here, and I'm going to delete everything within the return. So I'm just going to get rid of all of this. And right over here, I'm just going to create a new div, and we'll give it a h1 header, and then we'll just call this our counter. So now if we take a look at our application, we should just see counter app right over there. Perfect. So coming back over here, now what we're going to do is create a component here for our login. So I'm going to create a new folder here. I'm going to call this components. And in that components folder, I'm going to create a new file called login.tsx. And in this login.tsx, we're going to create our login component here, which is going to have our connect button. So we'll create a React functional component here, and we'll just say return. And in here, we're going to create a div, right? And for this functional component, I'm also going to tag this with use client. And in this div here, we're going to center this div. So I'm going to give it some styling here to center it, which is going to give it a display flex, align everything in the center, and give it a height of 100% of the view height here. And now all I'm going to do here is, again, add that connect button. And with the connect button, we need to provide it with the client, which we're going to provide it with our client variable from our constants.ts file. So you can see here, we're going to import client from that constants file. We'll also specify the chain here. So in here, we can specify the chain that we want our wallet to connect to. And in this case, it's the chain that we specified in our constants file as well. So let's come back to our app here and take a look at it. Oh, actually, let's add that. Sorry, come back to our code editor. Let's add our login component to our pages here. We're just going to come in here. We're going to add in our login, which I didn't export down here. So let's come back here, make sure we export our login, and then we can import this here. There we go. Come back to our app, and there you go. You can see we have a connect wallet button centered. So let's get rid of that counter app actually really quick. We don't need this here. There we go. So now when we click that connect button, you can see we're brought up with our connect modal here. This is a pre-built component by ThirdWeb. You can sign in with social logins, MetaMask, Coinbase Wallet, all of these different options. We introduced any wallet as well. So if you hit all wallets here, you actually can select up to over 350 wallets here. You can just search the wallet that you're looking for, and a user can connect to your Web3 application with any of those wallets. Now we also have the option to create a compact version of this. So this is our wide version of our modal. We can actually come back in here, come into our login. Under our connect button, we can set the connect modal here, and we can set the size, and we're going to set the size to compact. Now if we come back and we open that up again, you get this nice compact version over here. Social logins is the prominent here, but you can connect a wallet, and again, select any wallet or any of the over 350 wallets we now support. So if I connect a MetaMask wallet here, you can see we have a MetaMask wallet now connected. My wallet address, my balance, we're connected to Sepolia testnet. That's the only chain that this application is supporting, so we're not going to show anything else. But what happens if I was, let's say, connected to a different chain? So I'm just actually going to come into my MetaMask wallet here, and I'm going to switch over to Ethereum mainnet. And you can see here now the button switches to switch network. So if I hit switch network, it's going to prompt me within my wallet to switch to the network that the application needs to use. So we can hit switch network here. And you can see switches me back to base Sepolia, and we now have our wallet connected. I can disconnect, reconnect back, and you now have the ability for users to connect their Web3 wallets to your application simply by just adding the connect button React component from ThirdWeb. So now that we have a button connected to our application, we can now again interact with the smart contract that we deployed. Now we need to come back to our documentations here real quick. And how do we start interacting with those smart contracts? So we create a client, we create a chain. Let's take a look at contracts here. We can get instance of our contract to interact with by using the get contract here. We need to provide it a few things. And from there, we can start, again, building out UI components within our app to interact with our counter smart contract. We're going to come back to our code editor. We're going to come back to our constants.ts file. And I need to set up a couple things first. We need to get our contract address. So we'll say contract address. And this is going to equal the contract address of our counter contract. So let's come back to our counter contract. Let's copy that contract address. Let's paste that in there. And then we also want to get our contract ABI. Now our contract ABI, if we come back to our counter contract on our ThirdWeb dashboard here, if we come over to sources here, you can get the source code. You can see here our contract.so. This is the Solidity file that we created right here for our counter. And below that, we have our ABI. And this is going to be the ABI we need to provide the get contract. So we come here, you can see here that we have our get contract. We need to provide our client, the chain it's on, the contract address, and optional, but what we'll be able to do is provide it with our ABI here, and get contract will resolve that ABI for us. We'll be able to easily call the functions from our contract. So what I'm going to do here is come back to my contract dashboard, the ABI here. I'm going to copy that. Come back here under this contract ABI variable. We're going to paste, and I'm going to say as a constant. And now we have our contract ABI and our contract address. We can export a constant here. We're going to call this our contract, and this is going to equal get contract. And again, we provide it with our client, which is going to be our client, which is our variable right up here. We're going to provide it with our chain, which is going to be the chain that we defined at the top. We then have our address, which is going to be our contract address. And then we have our ABI, which is going to be our contract ABI. And that is going to provide us an instance of our contract that we can easily start to use within our application and interact with our smart contract. Now that we have the ability to interact with our counter smart contract, let's start building out the components to, one, read the data of our current count, and then increment and decrement our count. So I'm going to come to my files here. I'm going to create a new file in my components folder, and I'm going to call this counter.tsx. And in that counter.tsx file, I'm going to create my counter, which will be a React functional component. And then we're going to return, and I'll just put a div in here. Make sure we export our counter here. And I'm just going to give this div here some margin on the top. I'm going to provide it with a header here, and we're going to call it counter. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come into the login here, and we only want this counter to show up if a user is connected with a wallet. Now we want to make sure a user is connected with a wallet because they're not going to be able to interact with our counter unless they have a wallet connected that can execute the functions. So in our login page here, we have a connect button, but we don't really have a way to verify if a user is actually connected or not. But we do have a hook within our React components here. So let's come back to our documentations and we go to hooks here. And for wallet connection, we have a way of seeing if a wallet is connected, and that's through something called use active account. And use active account will return us the active account that is connected to our application, and it will provide us an account type here. If we don't have a wallet or account connected to our app, it's going to return us a undefined, and we can use that to double check and see if a user is actually connected. So coming back here, under our login here, we're going to create a variable here called account, and we're going to use the use active account hook from ThirdWeb, and that's going to provide us an account here. So within this, we can check, hey, if we have an account, then we can display our application. And if we don't have an account, then we're just going to show the connect button where a user can connect to our app. So I'm just going to paste this in here. I'll also paste that up top as well. And then we'll just make sure that we wrap these in a div to center it here. So I'll wrap this in a div here, wrap this one in a div as well. And in this connected one, so if they are connected, they should also be able to view our counter component as well here. So let's come back to our app. You can see here that we see our counter. If I log out, I shouldn't be able to see the counter until I connect with a wallet. And once a wallet is connected, we have our counter app here. So let's display the current value of our counter, which currently right now I believe is at 1. So if we come to explore on our contract dashboard, we go to read count. Yep, it's currently at 1. So we should be able to read this count value here and display it within our app. So coming back to our counter.tsx file, let's create a way to read that information. Now taking a look at our documentation here. So we take a look at some of the other hooks here. We have 2 React hooks that we can use within our SDK here. Use contract events, which we don't have events, but we could use the use contract read. And the use contract read hook here, you can see, provides us with the data that we get returned. We can also see the loading state here. We provide it with the contract and then the method that we want to call from the contract. So we can actually call our get count function here, and that will return us back the current count value. So coming back to our code editor here, under my counter.tsx file, I can create a variable here. Again, we get back data and is loading. And this is going to equal the use read contract hook here. And again, we're going to provide it with our contract, which is going to be our contract from our constants file. And then we're going to provide it with the method. Now, because we provide it with the ABI of our contract, we'll be able to resolve that and we can get our get count function. And again, that is going to provide us with the value of the count variable. Now I can rename this data here. We're going to name it count. And we're going to rename this is loading here to loading count. And now we can display this count variable here, which should have the value of the count variable from our smart contract. So right here, I'm going to say if loading count, we'll just display loading dots here. And then if we do have the count, then we're going to say h2, we're going to get the count data and we're going to say toString, and that should give us the current count, which in this case is 1. So I come back to my app here, you can see counter, and we're now displaying 1 because it's grabbing that data from our smart contract through the get count function that we created. So now we have a way to get data from our smart contracts using the use read contract hook. The next and the last thing we need to do for our application is create buttons to execute the decrement and increment functions from our contract. Now, if we come back to our documentations here again really quick, we can come back to the component section here, and we have something called a transaction button. Now, the transaction button is going to allow us to execute transactions from our smart contract. So in here, we're going to use the transaction button. We're going to create a transaction, And we're going to create the transactions for incrementing and decrementing our counter. So coming back to our code editor here, I'm first going to create a div right under here. This is just going to display flex our two buttons so that they're next to each other. And then we're going to create a transaction button here. The first one, we'll just give it a minus symbol for decrement. And then the following one, we will change that one to a plus symbol. So come take a look at our app here. You can see we have our two buttons, decrement and increment. They don't do anything yet because we haven't provided them with any transaction to execute here. And that's the next thing we need to do, is provide it with the transaction that we want these buttons to execute. Now, if we take a look at our documentation here, we'll come back to the TypeScript SDK. And under the TypeScript core here, we have a transaction section. Now, we're not reading a state or anything, but we do need to prepare a transaction. And this is what we're going to have to provide to the transaction button. So we're coming to preparing transaction here. And you can see we need to use the prepare contract call, provided the contract, the method that it is going to be calling, and provided any of the parameters that the function requires. For this basic app that we're building, the increment and decrement functions don't require any parameters. We just need to call the increment or decrement function. So coming back to my code editor here, under the transaction button, we'll do the decrement one first. So again, we're going to create a transaction, and we're going to use the prepare contract call. And that prepare contract call, we need to provide it with the contract it is going to interact with, which is the contract from our constants file. And then we call the method that it is going to call. And in this case, it is going to call our decrement function. We'll do the same thing for our increment, this time with just the increment though. And then we'll call the increment function here. Now within the transaction button, we have a few more things that we can set. So we can set things like on click, on error, on transaction confirmed, and on transaction sent. So on click, this is a callback that we can use for when someone clicks the button. So maybe if we want to toggle certain things or run a certain function, we can put that on this on click. On error is what will happen if there is an error with the transaction. On transaction sent, this is going to be for when the transaction is actually sent on chain. And then we have on transaction confirmed, and this is when the transaction has actually been confirmed on chain. So what we'll do is we'll say, hey, on transaction sent, we'll just do an example here. We'll just console log that it is currently decrementing. We can do the same thing for our incrementing. So we'll say on transaction sent. So when the transaction is sent on chain, we'll say incrementing. And then we can add on transaction confirmed. So this is when the transaction, again, is confirmed on chain. We want it to update the count. So what we can do here, where we use the use contract, where we use the use read contract, we can actually add a refetch here. And on transaction confirmed, we can just say, hey, refetch the current count, or refetch and get the count of the count variable from our smart contract. And we can do the same thing here for incrementing as well. And that will just update the value of our current count. And that's how easy it is to build a button to interact and execute functions with our smart contract. We just use the transaction button here. We prepare a contract call and we provide it with the transaction that the button needs to execute. And then we can create some callbacks and everything when the transaction is sent, confirmed, on the click of a button, on error, and we can really start to customize those buttons here. So if we come back now to our application, we have our counter here. It is set to 1. Let's actually open up our console here because we added those logs for incrementing and decrementing. So if I hit increment here, you can see it's loading. It should pull up our transaction, which we get right here. We do need to pay gas because, again, we are changing some data on chain. So we're going to confirm. And this here, you can see it's incrementing. And once it increments, it puts our counter up to 2. Let's do it one more time. Let's confirm this transaction here again. You see it is incrementing again, and now it is up to 3. Let's test the decrement here. So we'll hit minus. We'll get a transaction, we'll confirm. You can see here it is decrementing, and it decrements and our counter goes down to 2. And there you have it. We built a very simple Web3 application. We did everything from start to finish, and we're able to accomplish this really quickly and easy using ThirdWeb. We used ThirdWeb to create our very simple counter smart contract, and then we used the ThirdWeb's new Connect SDK to easily create a Web3 application that allows a user to connect a wallet and interact with our smart contract on chain. So I hope you folks enjoyed this video tutorial. If you did, give this video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell. We'll be releasing more videos on how to build Web3 applications with ThirdWeb's new Connect SDK. If you have any questions or you need any support, we'll drop a link down in the description below to our support channel where you can open up a support ticket, ask any questions you need help with, and our support team will be happy to help you out. But again, I hope you folks enjoyed this video, and until next time, see ya.